This is Emily Hall for the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State. Today is Monday, March 12th, 2018, and I'm interviewing Jane Vincent Taylor at her home in Oklahoma City for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project. Jane, you're a well-published poet, an accomplished editor, and a teacher. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Happy to do it, Emily.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Perry, Oklahoma, and that's where I grew up. My dad was a telephone man there. My mom stayed home, and I went to Catholic school, and though that would have been in the 50s, and I loved our Carnegie Library, which was one of the anchors to the town square, which is typical for Oklahoma towns. And I remember once when I was really little, I don't think I had actually started school yet, but I would walk with my mom to the library, and I remember telling my mom that I wanted to do what she was doing. And it's odd that I remember that because it was a long time ago, and I'm sure I didn't know the word librarian.
Yeah.
But, and then, eventually I did become a librarian, so, and I have to say a little bit reluctantly, but I had a great career as a librarian at University of Central Oklahoma.
Okay.
So from Carnegie Library to the library at UCO.
Are there any books that you can recall from childhood or maybe even later on that you felt transformed you in some way?
I remember sitting on the porch in the summertime reading, and my mother trying to get me to go on and do something active, go out and play, and I was sitting reading, and I think, it just was reading things like Nancy Drew. Yeah. The book that I finally remember that really knocked my socks off was really in high school, and it was the first time that I was exposed to Dylan Thomas. And we had a new English teacher. She was, she actually kind of reminds me of you, or you remind me of her. She came from, she was a new teacher. She came from OSU. We thought she was really cool. And part of it was because she was introducing a lot of literature that we, I think, probably had not heard before. And I also remember going to the library and getting everything that the library had by Dylan Thomas, which was significant, actually, now that I think of it. And I've written about that a little bit in some poems, but I think what I loved about it was the fact that I didn't really get it. That there was some beauty in the language, but it was definitely, as you say, transformative. It was moving. Language was moving in a way that didn't seem completely linear. Yeah. And I was curious about how that worked.
So did you keep journals or diaries as a child, or did you write poetry or short stories or anything?
I didn't.
Like that?
Not that I really remember. I married very young, had my children, and it was not really until I divorced that I started writing a lot. And at that time, I think it was, more therapeutic. I do remember keeping a journal during some sort of turbulent years and deciding not to do that anymore. I just thought, I'm not finding this to be anything that I would really want to look back on. Yeah. So I switched from writing journals to just keeping a notebook in which I played around with language, and none of it was dated or tied to, the calendar in any way. And that way I felt like if anybody found it, that perhaps they wouldn't even know it was me that wrote that.
Yeah, it's something you have to think about as a writer. If something happened to me all of a sudden, people
Eventually
found
you have to get over that.
Yeah. So you studied at OU for your BA, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Women's Studies?
Right.
What year was that?
That was I went to OU in 76.
Okay.
So it was just really the beginnings of women's studies at the academic level.
Yeah.
I had actually gone to OU and was going to go into classics. And then it sort of occurred to me rather quickly, there were no women much in here. So I switched, and the thing about it is that for women's studies at that time, you basically wrote your own program.
Oh.
There was not at that time a solid curriculum. So it allowed me to take a lot of history, which I loved, and and social sciences and literature, and so I was really fortunate because every semester I just designed what classes I wanted to take, went to the professors and said, can I take this class, and will it be a problem for you if I focus my papers on something about women? Because I'm going to be a women's studies major, and they were pretty open to it. So I loved my geography classes. I always found ways to, look at the geography of Oklahoma and Oklahoma women. And
that's interesting.
Sense of place was really interesting to me, and how it affected women, especially who came to Oklahoma for us, and found a certain amount of freedom, but still pretty, their lives were pretty circumscribed, and how they dealt with that. So I really loved my women's studies program, and I thought it would be like an albatross around my neck. I thought, okay, women's studies, that's my bachelor's degree, and then I decided to go into library science. And it was really kind of perfect because I had exposure to, all the departments. So I knew basic, sociologists, I knew the basic theories of history. These things I had learned because my classes were so spread across departments. And so it helped me as a librarian not to be, you'd think that women's studies would be narrow, but actually in my case it seemed like it was broad.
Yeah, interdisciplinary.
Interdisciplinary.
So did you start working as a librarian right after you graduated, or? Okay.
I went to SMU in Dallas, and was there for just a short time. And then a position opened up at UCO, and that's where I had my career. And that's really where I started taking writing lessons.
Okay. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That was my next question. Yeah. How did you find out about the courses? Were you still working full time and taking things at night, or?
Exactly. I was interested. Well, I'll tell you, there's a personal aspect of this as well. My dad died so I came to work at UCO in 86.
Okay.
And my dad died in 91. And when my dad died, my mother had died previously, so that's a big change in our lives when we lose both our parents. And I felt like that was the occasion that made me really decide to write from the heart. And I had so much academic writing in my undergraduate, and then of course in library science, writing for journals and things like that I had kind of really turned off of writing. I just felt like I had forgotten how to write any other way.
Yeah.
And but after my dad died, I decided that I perhaps needed to go to a therapist. So I got some counseling, and I went for a couple of weeks, and then it occurred to me, and she was such a good person. I said, I really appreciate, you're listening to me talk about this process and how I don't want to get stuck here.
Yeah.
And, but I think I'm going to go take a poetry class. And she said, oh, that will be money well spent. So that was when I first took the class with Betty Shipley, and it was an evening class, and it was a graduate class, and I kept looking at the catalog and thinking, should I do this? It seemed scary to me, actually.
Yeah, it can be intimidating.
Yeah. And I called her and introduced myself to her, and I said, I'm a librarian, and I can take this class at 5:30 when I get off, but I really need to ask you because I see it's a graduate seminar, and I've never written poetry before, really. Of course I had, but it seemed like I hadn't.
Yeah. And
she said, okay, I'll tell you what, if you come to my class and it doesn't change your life, I'll give you your money back.
Okay.
That was my response. Exactly. Okay. And she did change my life. She really did. And I took a lot of classes from her without any particular goal of getting a degree. I just got, I remember the very first night that I drove home after taking her class. And there were graduate students in there that knew a lot of poets. She handed out many handouts with poets that I'd never heard of, contemporary poets that I just didn't know. And so I was definitely out of my comfort zone. But as I drove home that night, I remember thinking, I can do this. There's something about this that, I knew that I was really a rookie. But I thought, you know what, this might be my thing.
Yeah. And did you workshop? And that what did you think of that experience?
Oh, it was scary.
Yeah.
I met one of my great friends in that very first class. Her name is Judith Tate O'Brien. She's also an Oklahoma poet, and she and I became really very good friends and longtime writing partners. So having another woman in that class that was not, real young, really helped me, get comfortable in there. And but Betty was really good at workshopping. She had lots of rubrics that we could use. It wasn't there wasn't anything mean in any way about it, although she was clear about what kinds of things she thought were mistakes. But she did, sometimes even now when I'm writing a new poem, I kind of have a round table of my favorite poetry teachers in my head, and I always think that if I read the poem and I pretend that Betty is sitting next to me, I still have a sense of what she might think.
Yeah.
Is weak in the poem. Even though I don't always follow her advice. I'm sorry, Betty.
That's okay. So your class, I'm curious about the makeup of the class. Was it mostly young women, or were there many men in the class as well?
There were quite a few young guys in there as well who really loved their poems.
Yeah.
I remember there was a young guy in the poem that said, I hope nobody in the world ever writes another poem about a tree.
Oh.
He was very clearly wanting to move on in subject matter, which was fine, and I'm sure he did. But every time I put a tree in my poem, I do think of that kid. I thought, see, we're still there. A tree is still a thing.
There's still something to say. How do you think poetry has changed you, just your life or your point of view or the way you even look at daily life?
Well, it's that you just said. It's about looking. It's, a certain way of being alert, not just really, I mean, certainly alert to language, but just kind of a way of being in the moment. Again, because I wrote so long when I was working, when I was driving home to Oklahoma City from Edmond, I came down Kelly, and there was a corner, I think it was at the corner of Kelly and Hefner, which has changed much now, it's developed, but there used to be a field of cows there and a stop sign. And I would come to that stop sign and I would look at those cows, and it was sort of like the threshold of my coming from home to work. And it felt to me like the threshold of coming home from being in a very busy, task-oriented mode, and coming home to be the poet. I mean, there was just something about that corner and the way the evening light was coming in on those cows. So even cows you can write about.
Yeah.
Trees and cows and grass.
Just what's around you.
Yeah.
What was it like publishing your poetry for the first time?
Well, that's something that my friend Judith O'Brien and I still talk about sometimes, was how much we loved waiting for the postman. Now most of publishing gets done online, so, it's not the same, but, it was exciting to get an acceptance. It was very exciting. And, but it also, it teaches you to be really thoughtful about your work, because if someone rejects it, it doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that it's not worthy, but it might mean, it's worthy of looking at again, and seeing if somehow you went off the rails, most likely at the end.
Endings are hard to, it'd be hard to get. So you're interested in collaborating with other poets and artists, and I just wanted to talk about that. I think that's a really interesting thing that you've done. So your first collaboration was with Judith Tate O'Brien, right? The Grace by the Grace of Ghosts. What was that?
That came from that came from the fact that we were meeting every Monday for a lot of years. But that was in the early days, and we would come to each other's houses on Monday, and we would bring a poem, and we would send each other away each time with a seed word. There was nothing very sophisticated about this exercise. And then the next week we would both bring our poems that, were generated from that seed word. So eventually we had quite a few poems, and we just decided that we would do a book of kind of companion poems, and her book on linoleum, my book on linoleum, that kind of thing. And that's a book that when I think back to, we sent that out to some possible publishers, and at that time, quite a few publishers said, we like these poems, but we don't want to deal with two authors. And so we ended up, getting it published with Dorothy Alexander. And so because we were determined to do it. I mean, by that time we were just like, now. If you say no to two authors, we're definitely doing it. So that was that was the kind of the beginning of this idea of how much I loved the sharing aspect of not only working but of putting it out there in the world in a collaborative way.
Yeah, there's that community aspect as well, where you can't write and publish if you don't have readers or peers to interact with. What year did you publish that book? Do you
Oh
remember? I
gosh.
think the next one we were going to talk about was 2007 with Anita Skeen.
Okay, let's see.
That's okay. You can think about it
Yeah,
later. We
I
can add
can't.
a note.
I could probably figure it out, but I'm not sure when it was.
Okay, that's no big deal.
Yeah.
But let's talk about when we say
When we say
shelter.
shelter.
Yeah.
Well, that would have been, yeah, so 2007. In about 97, I started going to Ghost Ranch, and that's where I met Anita Skeen.
Oh.
And you know, I took a couple of her classes, and then I got invited to teach there, and so I've been teaching out there since then. But we kind of did a lot of the same thing. We sent each other poems. We sent each other exercises. We got to be really great, and still are very good friends. And we just decided that we each had enough poems that we had written from being at the ranch that we thought it would be nice to publish them as, again, companion poems. And that book was published by Ina Hughes, who is a writer from Tennessee, and she had a small press called Owl Press. So she published those companion pieces, and you know that was a particularly nice collaboration because so many people at the ranch had heard us read those poems over the years. So we had kind of a built-in audience, which is really nice if you're going to publish a book. Figure out who might want to buy one.
Right. And the Ghost Ranch is such a well-known place for artists. What's it like creating there? Kind of maybe comparing and contrasting it to what you may see here in Oklahoma. What's it like there?
Well, I don't know of any place in Oklahoma that's in any way comparable to Ghost Ranch.
Yeah.
Except occasionally when you're with people in any situation and people are really listening to each other, then I think, okay, this is like Ghost Ranch. Even though nothing else about it is like Ghost Ranch.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that I've loved over the years about teaching and about being at Ghost Ranch is the fact that we have a full week, which is, I suppose, you know, we often say at the end of the week, if only we had 2 weeks. But we have a full week to really get to know each other and for people to build up a certain amount of trust and comfort with each other. The landscape there just, I can't really talk about that very well. It's just wakes you up. You know, it just completely wakes you up. And I often tell people that are coming out for a week at Ghost Ranch, especially if they're going to be in my class, I say, you know, we're going to start on Sunday night. By Monday, quite a few of us will be crying because, or by Wednesday, because I always feel like it takes that long for people to actually get there. And it's not really necessarily because they're telling us something really sad. It's because they just sort of emptied out from the daily routine of stuff that there's just so much space. I mean, there's literally space and then there's metaphorical space. And people just are just many times on Wednesday teary-eyed. And I just look out at the group and think, okay, it's Wednesday. And we've all arrived at the ranch.
Yeah.
So it's great. I mean, it's many, many years of creative energy that sort of rests in that rock bowl. And I've never known anyone that wasn't moved by it. I've never heard any. I mean, I've heard people say the food here is really terrible at the ranch.
Oh.
But by the time you're at the ranch, you really don't care that much about the food.
Yeah, not really going there.
No. You can go to Santa Fe for that.
Yeah. So I'm just going to skip over to What Can Be Saved. So that you published that in 2008.
Yeah.
2009.
Well, that book has to do with what I consider my favorite literary ancestor, who was my Aunt Ray, and she was autistic, and she loved words.
Yeah.
And she always saved them, and she would get on a word. And when I would come, she lived with my grandmother, and when we would go in the summertime or at Christmas time to visit our relatives at my grandmother's house, my Aunt Ray would always take me aside and tell me what her latest word was. And it was, she would sometimes say things to me like, "Do you think I'm crazy?" And I'd say, "No, I like your word." She was, so I began to write a little bit about her. And at first with that book, I felt a little bit like I was, wasn't, should not maybe be allowed to write about her and my grandmother. And so, but I tell you, the fact is, like so many times when you have a resistance to writing about something, the poems just start coming, and you think to yourself, it doesn't sometimes feel like you're actually doing it, but of course you are doing it. And so that book was the first book of what I think of as, persona poems in the voice of someone very much like my aunt. And I changed the name and thought, and sometimes put a little distance there, but her voice was definitely in my head, as well as my grandmother.
Yeah, and there's an authenticity about that too. Mama and Luppy, right? It was almost like a conversation or a duet, kind of revealing their inner lives, because they both had their own points of view about what their experiences were like.
It's very, it's so difficult to have an adult child that you are going to be living with for the rest of your life. And, there's such great dedication and love there, but it's so frustrating. And I always thought my grandmother was really kind, but she could lose her temper with my aunt. Like, go down there and clean out the basement like I told you.
What did you want readers to understand about, and you've kind of talked about that a little bit, but just about mothering a child with disability, or maybe about the mother herself and her struggles?
Yeah, I think, when I first started writing those poems, I was really just writing the lovey poems about the woman. And so I felt like I was kind of trying to figure out what the inner life of people who seem so different, and maybe we haven't looked carefully at or maybe we haven't had that much access to what their inner life is like. But then when I realized as I was writing the book that the grandmother had something to say about all this, then the book itself took a little bit of a turn, in the sense that it was really about the conflict and the interwoven lives of the two of them, and what they needed that sometimes they couldn't help each other with.
Yeah.
So it started out as one thing, and then since the grandmother character piped in, then I had to deal with that.
Yeah. And the cover art for that book by Jared Smith, the image, it's so striking. It's a woman with her back turned. She's shirtless with these bony wings with the words kind of in the background.
Yeah.
Why that image?
Well, I met Jared at a reading at UCO, and he was a student at that time. and he had a small exhibit outside the hall, and I just fell in love with that image, and it just stayed with me. And when I finished the book, I just thought, I think I want that image of Jared's, and he kindly sold me the image for the book.
And speaking of that subject, so the next book I wanted to talk to you about, The Lady Victory, has this beautiful image by Sarah Atlee on the cover. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So The Lady Victory was published by Turning Point Press, and they are, one thing I really like about them, they've done 2 of my books, is that they're very good at designing covers, but they also will, let you pick your art, or at least advocate for your art on the cover. And so when I decided that I needed something really striking for that book, I went to Sarah. She's an artist that I've always admired. And I went to her studio. She had read the poems, and she came out on a big table and laid out a lot of work. And there were pictures of young girls that could have been used for the cover of that book, but I realized that I didn't want something. I wanted something a little bit more abstract, because with the image of the woman that Sarah created, it actually could be. It could be, the girl, and it could be the nun.
Yeah, that's it.
So you don't
ambiguous.
really have to read the poems with a picture of someone in your mind. You have the freedom to picture these people the way you want. But the image of the woman on the cover is a woman that's conflicted, and you'll notice that her mouth is not completely able to speak. So I felt like that was also something that was sort of tied to the the poems themselves, the difficulty of telling the story.
And let's talk about the context of this book. So there's 3 sections, and this takes place at a home for unwed mothers.
Right.
Is that, or where that nuns? What was this taking place in the 60s, 50s, 60s?
Basically 1960.
Okay.
So right at the cusp of the turning of the new decade. The Catholic Church at that time, had maternity homes. I mean, since then, I think I don't know that they have them anymore, because they
no wondered about that.
New different ways of, for one thing, many more choices for young girls today. But yeah, and it was, so it's based on my own experience. I mean, one of the things I often say about the girl in The Lady Victory is that she's based on my own experience, but she's stronger than me. So in some ways I feel like she's like me, but she's not me. And I would imagine that's, in that way, I'd say that these poems are also persona poems, where I kind of create the person.
Yeah.
But I do a lot of the poems are built on real experiences that I remember. The nun, the letter poems, were written very quickly in a succession of early morning writing sessions, and I had no idea where these poems were coming from. I mean, I do remember the nun that I was concerned that I thought might be actually having kind of a breakdown. I mean, I have an image of her in my mind, but of course, as the girl I was then, which was 14, I couldn't imagine what her life was like.
Yeah.
You know, but as later I could imagine it, and I did imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so that's where those letter poems are complete works. I would say complete works of fiction. But I'm very fond of the letter as an art form. So I had
it's direct, and the sense of loss. It's just so palpable in the book, from the girl narrator to the nun, to how you tie it all up later at the end, which that's something you would have to deal with in that sort of situation, I think. But the letters, it adds this other dimension to me, just as the reader, of just kind of the other side of everything, which I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, like I said, those books about being in the home, I wrote those after being at Ghost Ranch for a week, and I was driving home on I-40, and I started just these, little stories started coming to me, and I pulled off the road a couple of times to write some notes to try and get this down. I was by myself that particular trip, and by the time I got to Fort Worth, I decided to stay in this little Motel 6 so that I could write these poems. So I wrote the bulk of those poems in one trip home. And I will say another thing about Ghost Ranch is that you get to Ghost Ranch and things start coming to you. You might not actually write everything that you need to write the week you're there. And this was an example of how I just, I'm coming home and I think I'm through for the week. I don't think I was quite through. But shortly after that, I got a residency at Virginia Center for Creative Arts, VCCA, and I spent 3 weeks at VCCA, and I was going to write, my proposal to them was that I was going to write this book. I can't remember what I called it, but I had a manuscript in mind, and I was going to shoehorn these Lady Victory poems somehow into this book. Now, I don't know why I thought that was a great idea. Perhaps I wanted to kind of hide these in there. Hide these in another book. And so I spent 3 weeks, and I had a great time at VCCA. And I came home, and I had this manuscript, and I almost immediately sat down and looked at it, and I thought, this is so much crap. And, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say that.
That's
anyway,
okay.
I set it down.
You can say whatever you want.
And I thought, okay, this is not a book. This is not a book I want to publish. Tore the whole thing apart, and that's shortly after that is when these other poems about Sister B came to me, and I thought, okay, see, this is the work. It's not a piece of something else,
Yeah,
so
it's interesting how that happens. Where you complete a draft and maybe you think it's kind of done, and then is it just for you? Was it intuition, or just having some space away from it and looking at it? How did you know that's what you needed to do, or is that even a question we can answer?
I don't know if I can actually say. It's just that that's one of the things about going to a residency where you have a certain amount of time. I think I was just trying to make a manuscript that would make some sense. But when I got home, it just didn't make sense. I realized, that it was, what we talk about sometimes is like the arc of the book was just completely, there was no arc of the book. It was just a, collection of poems that didn't really work together. So then it was quite discouraging after.
Yeah, I could imagine that's hard.
But you have to.
It's part of the
make
work.
It better.
Yeah, and then it was adapted into a play, right? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I had this manuscript, and I didn't know, for sure what to do with it. I mean, I didn't know where to send it out, but I started sending it out. And then I gave it to my friend Anita Skeen, who, my Ghost Ranch pal, and she took it back with her to the university, and she, at that time, was sharing an office with one of the dramatists, one of the other faculty members from the drama department, and she said, I'm reading this collection of poems by Jane Taylor, and she said you might be interested in them, and she looked at them, and then she contacted me and said, I wonder if you would mind if I use these poems in my class. I have a class going that's called something like, writing for the stage. I don't know, it was something like writing for the stage with unusual source material or something.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't quite what it's called. But anyway, so I thought she was just going to use it in her class, and I thought, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And then she contacted me a while later, and she said, no, I love these poems, and I would like to write a complete full-length play based on these characters, using your poetry, but dramatizing the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, that would be really interesting. I said, but how are we going to work together? And she said, well, we can Skype and talk, and you can look at the pages as they're going and tell me what you think. So I worked with her, and I have to admit that because I'm not a playwright and because I don't work in drama, it was hard for me to see what this play was, how it was really going to be.
Yeah.
But as she began to stage it, I was really blown away with what she did, and it became part of a series that they did at Michigan State that was called New Plays in New Ways. And so,
what was it like seeing the performance?
It was very emotional. I was completely stunned. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to say that I was able to watch the play in rehearsal before opening night, so that I could just be emotional and be sort of a little bit crazy. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a heavy topic. And it's close to you. And
right. And
you're hearing your words voiced, but it's not by you. So that must be really strange.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it happens in the arts a lot. I mean, now when I hear people talking about, or even when I'm watching a movie and I see that was taken from a book, I'm like, okay, I wonder how they liked it. Mm-hmm. But I loved the play, and I loved the young women that were in the play. I went up for a couple of discussions with them because some of them said, I've never heard of a maternity home. They are living in another world. This seemed very odd to them, which I was very happy to think that they, when they think of, becoming pregnant inconveniently, too young, they don't necessarily go to shame. Yeah. So they were, I think they all told me that they were very moved by doing the play and thinking about these issues.
Yeah, and just the whole issue of it kind of puts into context what life was like for a lot of women during that time period, which is why it's important to know about that part of the past, so we don't regress.
Right.
Yeah. So Pencil Light, that seems to be more, that's your next book or your latest book, right? That seems to be more about daily life in Oklahoma. To me, that seemed to inform those poems.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
where you're going with it?
Yes. I realized that I had a lot of poems, and I enjoyed writing poems about my neighbors and about my local coffee shop and about the guy that, nearly gets run over down on Classen every day on his little bike. And, I realized that I wasn't interested in doing more persona poems or, a long narrative piece. I just wanted to say how much I loved my neighborhood, and that was also because I had this, and still actually work on this series called The Local Poet, and that little phrase helped me a lot when I would see something that I wanted to write about. I would give it a title,
Yeah, the local poet. Those are fun. So you have one called The Local Poet Visits Elementary School. So it's kind of like this newspaper sounding headline. It's kind of dry, but then you get into the poem.
I liked the idea that the paper would headline their local poets. Why not?
Yeah.
But so it was kind of tongue-in-cheek that way.
And then that particular one kind of spoke to a school that had a lack of resources. Students felt maybe a little unsafe.
I was two of my kids are public school teachers, and my daughter has primarily worked in schools that are, kids are really at risk, and I was doing some work with her class and with that school, and I was just so shocked about the idea that they couldn't have recess.
Yeah.
And I said, why in the world would you not have recess? Of course, that is sometimes an issue. I mean, just in and of itself, recess. But she said, it's not really safe outside. And I thought, I don't think people are really saying that very much out loud. It's like that. Let's just say, we don't have time for recess because we have to have more instructional time, to get everybody ready for taking the test. There's that. And I thought, it's just, and lack of resources, and besides the fact that the kids are just all so beautiful that I wanted to write about them.
Yeah. It was a moving poem that brought to life so many issues that we have, that we're facing here currently in
that
education.
Is an old poem. So things are coming to a head now.
When did you write that? Do you remember?
Gosh, I want to say, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and then the next poem that actually comes right after that, New Law Makes Local Poet Nervous. You published that in Miss Land Press originally. So tell me a little bit about that. What made you nervous?
That was another time when I was just aggravated no end about Oklahoma's love affair with firearms, and we had just passed this open carry law, which I just was dreading going into places, my favorite places, and having to look at, people armed with holsters and stuff like that. And so I went to my local coffee shop one morning. It was right after Christmas, and there were little kids in there, and it seems like such a safe place. And a guy walks in, and he has a shoulder harness on, and I looked away. I mean, I just thought, oh no, this is just what I thought. And then when I looked up as he was ordering his coffee, I realized that it was an oxygen bag that he was carrying. So I thought to myself, when guns become such a political issue and guns become such a fetish for so many people, the gun does what it's supposed to do. It scares the heck out of us. I mean, we step back. We see that there's a gun. But the other thing about fear is that you start to see, the fear starts to infect other things that you see that are not actually, a threat to you. But you're in a state of fear. And so that's, the poem was meant to be a little bit funny. But that's, and that poem was picked up to be in a high school textbook.
Oh, wow.
So, I'm really happy about that poem because I know it gets read around, and I've heard people say, somebody read your gun poem. I thought, oh great, now I have a gun poem.
Gun poet.
But most of the time, my heart and my work does not go to a confrontational place. But sometimes, I just feel like some things have to be worked out in language in a way. I don't want any poem to be completely didactic, like I think I know what the answers to things are, but I can describe the problem, and hopefully in some way that will get someone's attention, and think, maybe we should think this over.
Yeah, and there's still a place for that poem, especially now that we're looking at the possibility of public school teachers having guns in the classroom, and children are scared or are thinking about their environment in ways that maybe some of them didn't before. Maybe kids in more affluent places in schools are starting to have that fear. That's kind of a contrast to the students you talked about earlier who can't have recess. So we can only hope that we'll have more conversations.
Yeah. Every teacher that I know is absolutely opposed to more arms in the school and themselves being armed. It's just ridiculous. I have to hope that we're not going to take it that far. But I was in a classroom with my daughter one time when there was a not a shooter, but a drill.
Oh.
And I have a fairly new poem about that. I haven't seen it out anywhere, but after the Parkland shootings, I just thought about how frightening it is for kids. Just it's just now. And they spoke to it. The students spoke to it and said, we've been doing these shooter drills for our whole, lives in school. And
wow.
I sometimes think if a politician had to go to a school and hunker down with 15 little kindergartners, and all of them shaking, and some of them crying, and some of them just acting up, see what this is.
Because what you're teaching them to be preparing for.
Yeah.
That's a lot for a little mind.
Yeah.
To process.
Right.
And that little. Oklahoma, where there's definitely good people here, and you can find the people with a very generous, helpful spirit, but then there's the other side to this place. And one of the things I've been talking with other writers about is, how do we understand Oklahoma and its contradictions? How do we understand this place?
Well, sometimes I think about the fact that Oklahoma was split from the very beginning. Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, and that we have this big wound. Yeah. This is just me talking, but I have sometimes thought that it might be that we, have certain historical wounds that are really hard to reconcile. And when you have ideologies that promote, a very harsh individualism as opposed to a communal attitude toward solving problems, I think we can get really in a bad place.
Yeah.
So.
Which is all the more reason.
But I think one of the reasons that I wanted to put together that pencil light was because I felt like there are so many. Many of the poems in pencil light were written of me looking out my window, and the woman that used to live across the street, her name was Helen, and she's featured in some of the poems. She died when she was 97, but she was able to live. She had no family. She had never been married, and she was completely without kin. And she lived in that house till she was 97. She was blind. My other neighbor over here, Johnny, went and checked on her every day. When we had the ice storm and we had no electricity, I slept over there with her sometimes at night.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that go on that I want to write about, that I want to say, these are people that save other people, that help other people get by.
Yeah.
And, sometimes it's the teachers and sometimes it's the neighbors and, but I'm worried about my state. Yes, I am worried about my state.
How can we encourage our writers here in Oklahoma to keep going? I'm just thinking of that question in context of what we were talking about, what's happening in the state, how this place can feel kind of hostile towards artists or creating your art.
Well, I don't know if I know the answer, except that I think I kind of bring some of my 20 years or so of experience with Ghost Ranch to that question, because it seems to me that the way people, artists and I don't even know if I want to say artists, because I just think that everybody has a sort of creative spark. And I think that anytime you get together or have any kind of coming together, either whether it just be, among friends or whether it be a larger group, that a recognition that the artist is not so much special as it is the artist is looking at the world through a more complex lens. And that everybody has access to that. Honestly I think it's if they play more.
Yeah.
If even though we're talking about serious problems that have got to be solved through policy,
right,
and thank you, taxes and money, I think the way you keep going, or the way you keep, hopeful and vital in what you're doing, is by not getting too wrapped up in the difficulty of it, and try and be with people in a playful way. That sounds like I'm making a big contradiction, but
no, though there's a lightness to all of the seriousness that you were discussing, and language can help with that. I think. So, what's the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
Oh, I know what that is. I think the one that I was thinking of just this morning. is the poet Naomi Shihab Nye. She is one of my favorite poets, and I was at a workshop with her one time years ago in Tulsa, and we were mostly all working writers. I know I was, and a lot of people around the table, and somebody asked her, about how to get the work done.
Yeah.
And she said, write 3 sentences every morning before you go to work. And I've been doing that since.
Wow.
And that's what I tell my friends at Ghost Ranch, my students at Ghost Ranch.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure it doesn't hold for everybody, but the thing about 3 sentences is that everybody knows how to write 3 sentences.
Right.
And, if you say I'm going to write a poem before I go to work, that's too daunting.
Yeah.
Just write, even if your 3 sentences are all the same sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it's the kinetic activity before you've gotten into your scheduled day.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is that you probably won't stop at 3 sentences if you have time for another 3.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the years that I was working, I didn't have a lot of time before I went to work, but I always had something percolating in my notebook because I had put down the 3 sentences. And I could look at it at noon, or I could look at it at night, or I could look at it the next day.
That momentum, like you said, that kinetic energy.
Yeah. Just get it.
Yeah.
Get yours.
That's good advice. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I seem like I've been talking and talking.
Covered a lot of ground.
I don't think so. There's good questions, though.
Yeah. Great conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay.